Hey everyone, Dan Johnston here. I'm the Jack of all Ministries, and today I'm going to give you part one of the process that I went through in order to take this room and turn it into this room. When my family and I first moved out here to Illinois, we bought this house and we knew that the rooms were kind of designated from the get-go. My sister-in-law was living with us. She moved out here to Illinois with us. My parents were going to be retiring soon, and so they moved out here about 9 months later. So we needed rooms for them. But eventually, my sister-in-law got her own place. My parents were just here long enough to go through the process of purchasing their own home. And so when they got out, we were able to kind of free up some space. So this room was one that we basically used just for my kids to play video games and stuff like that. And really, it was just a utility room when we bought the house. But as they kind of got out of here and took one of those other rooms over, my wife came to me and said, why don't you use this room and make it something you want? Maybe you can build your studio. And I was really excited about the prospect of having my own space where I could do YouTube videos and then also have a place to play my drums and record music and stuff like that. So from that point on, I took a bunch of money and a bunch of time and invested it into this room. It took me 5 to 6 months worth of work. And then we set aside $3,000 to $4,000 to kind of get it done, which quickly steamrolled into more than twice that. I think we spent just under $10,000 to get this space done. But to be fair, that also included changing out to a tankless water heater, which was not part of the original plan. But it took some investment in order to get some stuff. To get the stuff done. But basically, I'm really, really happy with the way that everything turned out, and I spend quite a bit of time down here now. So in order to get all this stuff done, I had to start off with the planning phase. I would spend hours down here just kind of walking around the room, thinking about things, spotting problems that needed to be taken care of, trying to come up with a plan. How am I going to do this? How am I going to do that? And there were some interesting challenges that I came up with. And I actually made a video about the 10 things that I faced in planning this studio. And you can check out that video now if you want. But I came up with some solutions, and basically, even though some things came up in the midst of the process, I think a lot of the pre-planning that I did made it possible to kind of get around some of those things. So in the planning phase, I had to worry about what I was going to do sound-wise. We have a very small dog that is terrified of loud noises. We have neighbors that are not too far away from us. And I knew that even if my wife was okay with hearing my drums in the house, I was going to feel uncomfortable playing them at max volume, knowing that I was getting on her nerves. So I knew that I needed to build a studio that was going to be, if not soundproof, then at least, sound dampened to the point where I wasn't irritating her or the neighbors or the dog. And I knew that I needed to try to get as much space in here as I could, but, this is a fixed size room. I don't get to change the size of the room necessarily. And so I had to work with what I had. So during the planning phase, I figured out what the room modes were going to be in here, which I'll probably do a video on that in the future, because room modes are really important when you're figuring out the size of the room you're going to be in. And I was able to kind of adjust them and make them just good enough to get within the spectrum where they needed to be. But again, I'll talk about that in a future video. I also had to figure out how I was going to make some of this soundproofing stuff work, because I had an existing ceiling, I had a fixed size room, we had a furnace and a hot water heater in here that had pipes that were running through walls, and there were big holes and access to the chimney, and 2 doors getting in and out of here, and one of those leads into a guest room that we will probably still use in the future. So I had to figure out how we were going to make all of these things kind of click, and I came up with an interesting plan. Basically, what I decided to do was, instead of trying to soundproof the entire room, I was going to add a 4th wall in here that was going to create a hallway, and then I was going to put another wall there, cover it with louvered doors, and then make it so that there's actually a hallway that goes from the bottom of the stairs all the way to the guest bedroom. So if somebody was staying with us, I could be working in the studio. They could walk through to the guest room and not even know that I was in here. That was also going to make it easier to build a soundproof wall without having to deal with all the holes and pipes that were already existing. So once I decided that's what I was going to do, it was kind of off into the next phase. So what I did was I started doing a bunch of research on soundproofing materials. What methods can you use to make things quieter? What things do you need to stay away from? Things like that. And every time you go on a website that was talking about, this type of soundproofing material or that type of soundproofing product, they all promised you the world, but they also promised that they were going to charge you an arm and a leg for their materials. Then when you would find kind of, more DIY type soundproofing methods, a lot of them didn't seem like they were going to work very well, or like, the professionals would be very critical of it. And so I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do. So I decided that I was going to make up my own test. And I did a video on that as well because I wanted to find out how well do these materials work, because I'll spend the extra money on the material if I'm going to get the return. But if it's only going to be a little bit better, but it's 3 times the cost, I don't know that I want to invest in that, because my budget is only so much. And it ended up being as pretty, hefty, at least for me in the end anyway. So I did this test, and I knew that fortunately I had concrete walls on 3 sides that were going to be great. But the 4th wall was one that was going to be completely new construction, and I was not going to pour concrete because I don't even know how to do that. And then also I was going to have to deal with an existing ceiling that had a subfloor above it. And so as I went, I did all sorts of different things that you'll see as we go that was helpful. I built walls within the concrete walls. I did a double framed wall on the outside, which also included 2 different doors. And then I did a bunch of different things to make it soundproofed, and you'll hear about that as we go. So in order to get the space kind of working the way that I wanted it to, I didn't want to have to build soffits around everything. So anything that I could move and get out of the way and keep the room as kind of squared off as possible, I made sure that I did. Now I had stairs that were dropping into the room, and I just have no choice but to soffit around that. There were some radiator pipes in the room that I soffited around because, being from California, I don't know anything about radiator heat. So I don't know, can you just take those pipes apart? Can you cut them and put new ones in? Or are you going to have to do something to the system when you do that? I don't know. I don't want to do the work to find out. So I just soffited around those pipes. And to me, it's totally fine because it just left a little bit of a soffit that hangs into the room. And it actually kind of makes it feel like it divides my working area, computer-wise and stuff, from my drum area in the back. And so that was fine. However, the water pipes and stuff like that were in there, some of the wiring, I just went ahead and relocated that, put it up into the joists. It was no big deal, and it made it so that I could make a nice, clean room. So once I had a blank slate, I knew that I needed to start some of my soundproofing efforts, because it doesn't take a very big hole for sound to get through. Basically, if you have like a solid concrete wall that you can't hear people on the other side, if you drill a little 1/2-inch hole to run a pipe through it or something, you can have a conversation on the other side. So I knew that I needed to seal up as many little holes as I could, and the way that this room was built, there were holes everywhere. Where the concrete wall stops and the wooden joist floor above begins, there's a big hole there that I needed to fill. There were holes even from where I installed the TV in the concrete that I decided I was going to fill with caulking. There were holes around the stairs, and there were just things I needed to fill, but the biggest one that I needed to fill was the subfloor up above. I was not going to change out the subfloor there, and sadly I didn't do really any soundproofing when I installed the flooring up there because I never planned on doing this studio, so I wanted to seal it up the best I could. So the first thing I wanted to do was seal the cracks between the subfloor where sound can transfer through the air gaps there, because it's 1940s chipped away cracks where air can get through, and if air can get through, sound can get through. There is a little bit of a seal and some mass there to dampen the sound, but it's not quite enough for me. And so I really want to get as much of an air seal down here as possible. And so I went to Ace and I bought some of this elastic roof patch stuff. It's about $21 at Ace. You might be able to get it a little bit cheaper at a bigger box store or something. But I bought it mostly because, first of all, it feels rubbery when it's dry, so it kind of feels like there might be some mass there. But the real reason I got it is because it's elastic and it's thick. So I can use it to both fill in all the cracks, which can be up to 3/8 of an inch thick, which is pretty hefty for, you need a hefty amount of filler there. But the other thing is that it's elastic, and I live in Illinois where it can go below 0 up to 100 degrees, so it's a pretty big temperature swing throughout the year. And so as the floor kind of expands and contracts, it's going to want to crack any filler that you put in there. And if you're filling a crack and it later cracks, it's no longer doing its job. That creates a place for air transfer, and it's going to pick the sound right up. Then anywhere that had a crack that was too big for caulking, I went ahead and filled that with spray foam. And basically I sealed up just about every single crack or hole that I could find. And in the end, I think it ended up working out pretty good. So I must have found most, if not all of them. So while I was in the middle of putting up the safe and sound insulation, I remembered that there was another part of the project that I still need to do. My wife and I have been talking for a while about replacing our old tanked water heater and putting in a tankless one, but it can't vent out through the old vent, and it also needs to be have an inlet through piping to the outside as well. I decided to go ahead and put in that piping and then install the water heater later, and then my wife said, well, why don't you just get the water heater and do it now? So I'm going to knock that out, and then I'll continue on with the soundproofing. So I went ahead and I cut out the old water heater and listed it on Facebook Marketplace. Someone came and picked it up in a couple of hours, and as far as I know, they're still using it now. So that worked out good for them. So I got that thing out, installed the new one, and then I also ran some vents across the ceiling because this kind has an inlet and an outlet that you needed to install PVC piping for. But I also installed a concentric vent kit, which actually takes the two pipes and puts them into one. One actually runs inside of the other one. So there's still two separate lines, but you only have to cut one hole in your wall. And so that was nice because holes in your wall are not good for soundproofing. And so since I was out there cutting holes, I went ahead and cut another one for an AC vent because I wanted to install an air conditioning unit in the studio as well. So while I was up in the ceiling installing those pipes for the water heater, I wanted to do a couple of other jobs. One of the first things I did was I installed these light boxes, which was just an idea that I had myself. I knew I wanted to install recessed lighting, but I didn't want to cut big holes in this drywall that I was trying to seal up for sound, because I knew sound would just go right through one of these wafer lights. And so I decided I was going to build a box for it to be installed around so that there would be no way for sound to get through. What I've done here is I have built these boxes up into the rafters, and ultimately I'm going to have resilient channel coming across here, and I'm also going to square it off here and fill in the corners. I don't know how much help those boxes actually are because I just actually ran the wire itself through the hole in the drywall. So it's just a tiny little pinhole, just big enough for the wire to fit through, and then I sealed it. So there's not much space for sound to get through the drywall there because I installed the actual light on the outside of these clouds that I installed later. So I didn't really need the boxes. However, I thought about it, and in the future, if these lights ever go out, the only way that I could ever replace them would be to actually go up and cut a hole to get into the box, which then would create a problem. So at least I have these little boxes that I built to go behind the drywall, seal it up so that there's really no way for sound to get through. So after I got the boxes in place, I went ahead and I installed some insulation over the top of the boxes, then kind of around the PVC pipe so that I would have some insulation material up there to prevent sound. That was existing construction and was one of the few things I could do to really add any type of mass up there besides drywall. So I went ahead and got the safe and sound stuff. It cost twice the price of R13. Seems like they perform about the same, but I figured, you know what, this stuff's designed for soundproofing. Maybe it does better in lower frequencies than the R13. I really don't know, but I figured it was worth spending, $100 instead of $50 just to make sure that I did everything I could to keep sound from transferring up through the floor that's above my head. So once I kind of had all that stuff done and kind of ready in the ceiling, it was time to work on the framing for the walls down here. Now, what I decided to do was just do the 3 interior walls first, and then the 4th wall that created the hallway was one that I was just going to do later. I didn't want to get to the point where I was putting insulation up on that 4th wall and I couldn't bring drywall and stuff like that into this workspace. So I decided I'm going to do these 3 walls, get them as done as I can possibly get them before framing, insulating, and drywalling the 4th wall. And I don't regret that at all because it kept the mobility going through the entire process. Because I had existing concrete walls down here, I knew that those were going to be my best chance for soundproofing because solid concrete is going to do a much better job than regular stick framing with just insulation and drywall. But I still wanted to add a wall on the inside of those on these 3 existing walls because it was going to, number one, give me more layers of sound dampening. But number two, it was also going to give me a better surface to hang things on and to work with because, just trying to attach things to concrete is way more of a hassle than trying to attach it to drywall. So I used 2x3 framing because it takes up less space and it's cheaper, and I left a 1-inch gap so that there was no chance for sound to transfer from the framing to the concrete wall. So I went ahead and I framed in all 3 of these walls, but then I also went and framed some of the soffit stuff up above because I had those stairs hanging in and the radiator pipes hanging in. I needed to build a soffit, so I framed around it so that there would be a gap between the new construction materials and the existing structure so that there was no chance for sound transfer. After that, I thought about getting ready to frame at least the top plate for the 4th wall, but then I realized that I was going to run into a problem. See, because I was going to be adding a wall and the top plate was going to go across the joist, I realized that there was going to be a wide open gap above the top plate inside of the joist. And for some reason, it took me a really long time to figure out exactly how I was going to plug those gaps. I thought, do I just shove it full of insulation, or am I just going to try to cut some funky shape out of plywood and stick it up there? And then I realized, well, floor joists are actually made out of 2x10s. So I could just get a long 2x10, cut out just the gaps and then fill those, and then cut notches where there's going to be wiring and pipes and stuff like that. And that ended up working out great. I cut them to size, put them up there, and then filled the gaps with spray foam and caulking, and it seemed to work pretty well. At that point, I was ready to go on to the next step, which is one that I'm going to talk about in part 2 of this series on building this studio down here. And so if you want to watch that, go ahead and click this up here and go check out the next video. So thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope that this was helpful or maybe even just a little bit interesting. And if it was, I'd appreciate it if you consider liking and potentially subscribing to my channel, because this is the type of stuff that I like to tackle. And with that, I hope that you have a good day, and we will see you on part 2 of my studio building process.